Hey guys, I'm Nathan from Arms and Armor. Today I want to tell you about some really cool research that I've had the opportunity to do. So this past weekend, two colleagues from the Oakeshott Institute and so Brandon Fote and Dale Utt, who is also of the Cleveland Museum and True Edge Archive, we went to the East Coast and we had the pleasure of handling all three of the extant 16th century longsword trainers that I know of in the United States. If you know of any others, let me know. I'd be happy to go and see them. I'd be very excited. So one is in the Higgins Armory at the Worcester Art Museum, which the curator, Jeffrey Forgang, was always super wonderful, and he had that trainer out for us to examine again. Got to look at it last year as well. And then the next day, we had the pleasure of going to the Metropolitan Museum in New York and handling and measuring the two fetters, that's what we call them today, that they have in their collection. Now, all three of these swords are from the middle to late 16th century. They're all German, and they all are examples of the kinds of training swords that you see in 16th century German fighting manuals like Meyer's, Joachim Meyer's 1570 text, or the other Meyer, M-A-I-R, just to make things confusing, his text that shows people fencing with these swords. So they are a Renaissance longsword trainer that was being used primarily, it looks like, by civilian guildsmen and such things to try and keep the art of longsword fencing alive. So getting to handle all these swords in 2 days and take a bunch of measurements of them was super interesting. And there are a few takeaways for you guys that I've been thinking about. The first is that the Met fetters, there's a pair of fetters that are essentially identical, and the Higgins fetter are very different from each other. Right? The Met fetters are much smaller than the Higgins example. So I've made a replica of the Higgins example, which is right here. Right? This sword is big. Right? It's got a really long grip, a wide guard, and it is really thick at the fort right here. And it gets really thin out here at the edge. It is about 0.3 millimeters thick out here in the last 1.5 inches of the blade. The Met fetters are much more similar to our Fechterspiel training sword that we make here at Arms and Armor. That was actually based on looking at the Met fetters back in the late 90s when Craig Johnson and Chris Poor at Arms and Armor went and saw an exhibition. They weren't able to handle them at the time, but they looked at them and did their best to produce something that people could use. So the Met fetter is almost 51 inches from point to pommel. The blade is 40 7/8 inches long, and the grip is 8 7/8 inches long, right? This is pretty similar to our dimensions. Our trainer is a couple of inches shorter than the ones in the Met because we based its length on looking at some of the manuscripts and estimating the length based on how tall we thought the people in the manuscripts were. Interesting, the dynamics and the balance point are just about exactly the same. So in the Met fetter, it balances exactly, both of them, at the end of the shield, right here, the shield, where that transition from this protective ricasso to the blade happens. That's exactly where the balance point is on those pieces, and it's pretty close on our example. Some other interesting things to note about the Met fetters: they weigh 2 pounds 14 ounces ish, right? Just about there, making them a little bit lighter than many modern pieces. And this is because of the very dramatic taper in the last third of those blades, right? So the Met fetters, the end thickness on those, one is 0.6 millimeters, one is 0.9 millimeters thick at the end. And they're clearly hammered out and they flare, they get wider at the point. When we made this one, we made some, we had some design considerations where we basically inverted the profile taper so that it's thicker back here and thinner out here, so that we could have the tip of the sword thinner this way. I'm sorry, thicker this way than the originals were, because having a 0.5 millimeter thick training sword is something that people are afraid of, because it is designed to cut you. People mostly don't want that. So in order to get it behave the same, we had to make some changes to the other profile in order to get this profile thicker and still have it perform similarly. Now, these Met fetters, which you can see these pictures I've been flashing, are highly decorated, and the decoration is later, right? The wear on the etched parts of the sword is very minimal compared to the wear on the blade, which suggests pretty strongly that that etching was done later. And the spiral cord grip on them is later as well, right? That is not the original grip that's on those. And you can tell by looking at the peen on those swords that that's a modern peen. So it was taken apart at some point and fancied up. So the Met thought that these swords probably belonged to Prince Rostakov, a Russian noble in, I think he was a 19th century guy, who was collecting these things, and he probably wanted to make them look princely instead of as kind of workaday tools. Now, these swords are really different from modern fetters, right? For a variety of reasons, right? Our modern swords, we mostly want a point that isn't gonna cut you. And the 16th century swords, the goal was to make your opponent bleed from the pate, right? From the scalp, without otherwise injuring them, right? So they kind of moved the mass back toward the sword to lighten up the tip so that when, they hit their friend or their, guildmate, it didn't kill them, but it just made them bleed. Obviously, this is a different game than we play today, right? We're afraid of bleeding on each other for all kinds of good reasons. And we wear protective gear that they didn't wear in the 16th century. Additionally, German fencing laws were apparently very restrictive of the thrust in the Holy Roman Empire, right? So if you thrust at another German, it was essentially showing that you had the intent to murder them. But if you cut them, you could argue it was in self-defense. And in these 16th century sources, we see that it's a very cut-focused art. I think that these tools, these training tools, were really designed for that, because that very thin last few inches of those blades, if you thrust someone repeatedly with those, I think you're gonna see significant failure out there, because that's really the spot where they're gonna flex. And you're not gonna get as much flex throughout the rest of the blade, which is what makes thrusting with these modern pieces relatively safe. So there's a cultural context to those, which is one of the reasons that we've changed them for the modern period, because we play a different game than they were playing in 16th century Germany. So some really cool stuff. In the future here, hopefully over the next few months, we're pretty busy right now, but we'll be mocking up some very close replicas of the Met fetters and doing some experimentation with them, along with the Higgins fetter that we've been fighting with for the past year since I made it. And at WMAW this year, Western Martial Arts Workshop, I hope to bring those swords so people can mess around with them and play with them and see what those original swords were really like. All right, it was an exciting time. Thank you guys. More info will be forthcoming. Bye-bye.